Tecmo is ready for some football on NES Works episode 107. Tecmo may have been left out in the cold with Star Soldier, a game that Hudson created by copying Tecmo's homework, then handing over to Taxan to publish in the US. But that's okay because it just meant that Tecmo understood the American market. I mean, look at the title screen for these two games. This actually goes a step beyond mere understanding into open, almost craven pandering. You have to respect Tecmo's naked desire to make it big in America. Not only did they put out two games based on the country's favorite sports, they draped the things in the American flag. And you know, it would be kind of pathetic if not for the fact that both games are actually pretty darn good. We start with the lesser of the two, Tecmo Baseball. The Famicom had so many baseball games back in the 80s that it's almost comical, and curiously, this wasn't one of them. Tecmo released Tecmo Baseball exclusively in the US market, despite the seemingly insatiable demand for the genre back home in Japan. I don't know if the company created the game specifically with the US in mind, or if they built it for domestic release only to pivot to an exclusively American launch once they took a look at the bleak, oversaturated Japanese market and realized they'd never make any headway with yet another baseball game. And certainly this wouldn't have been the baseball game to break through and top the charts. It's competent, but ultimately unremarkable. By this point in video game history, the beginning of 1989, the Famicom baseball market had become so overloaded by developers hoping to score a hit on the scale of pioneers like RBI Baseball or Bases Loaded by retreading the contents of those games that the genre had to subsist on novelty. Capcom forced a Portopia-style murder mystery into baseball. And Sunsoft exploited the right to manufacture their own cartridges with Non-Tatate Baseball, a game that could accept expansion carts to change out teams and stats. In such a landscape, a game like Tecmo Baseball, which plays more or less like Bases Loaded but has a bit of the RBI Baseball cuteness about it, had roughly zero chance of standing out in such a crowded field. So the company's solution appears to have been just to ignore Japan altogether and go all in on America. In fact, that largely describes Tecmo's philosophy going forward on NES and Famicom. They released remarkably few Japan-only 8-bit titles compared to other Japanese publishers of the era, and those mostly involve specifically Japanese interests like sumo wrestling, or properties like the Captain Tsubasa manga that hadn't been licensed into the US yet. Instead, they developed projects with strong international appeal, or, in this case, games specifically for the international market. Even so, Tecmo Baseball doesn't really feel remarkable in the US market at this point, outside of the fact that, unlike the other baseball games that have landed on NES to date, it has an absolutely scorching soundtrack. This would be a trademark of Tecmo titles going forward. Like Konami and Sunsoft, their games had a distinct sound quality that the enthusiast ear could easily recognize. Rather than filling time and space with vapid crowd whistles or the piddling little low-pitched ditties common to early NES titles, Tecmo Baseball rocks out with a driving beat and rousing melody. The music changes situationally too, such as the way it shifts into a triumphant sort of ragtime when a runner makes the bases. Tecmo Baseball does have a few things working against it, including the fact that the publisher didn't bother to lock down any sort of official license. No players, no teams, no stadiums, just a bunch of entities vaguely reminiscent of the ones you may recognize from television. Functionally, of course, this doesn't really make a difference to anything. The game plays more or less like any other baseball game, which I suppose is why licenses would make a difference to give the game a distinct hook. But instead it plays more or less like Bases Loaded, with the old hardball style behind the pitcher camera that switches to a Famista style bird's eye view of a field populated by chubby little guys once the ball is hit. Gameplay appears to be weighted considerably more toward defense than offense. You have quite a bit of granularity when it comes to pitching, whereas your batting options consist of moving forward and backward in the batter's box and choosing when to swing the bat. No high or low emphasis, just a matter of timing. I suppose that's just as well since the action in Tecmo Baseball moves a lot faster than in other NES baseball games. Each pitch crosses the plate in a split second, leaving very little time to react. And given the camera angle, you don't really have a fully square view of the plate, so it would be unreasonable to have to worry about the particulars of batting. This does give the batting team an advantage over the fielding side, though. While playing defense, you need to strategize your pitch type and maneuver your stocky little dudes under the ball once it's hit. On offense, all you need to do is make sure you time your swing well and take care not to get too greedy when going after bases. Tecmo Baseball suffers from the same flaws you'd expect from any 8-bit baseball title, especially when it comes to the outfield. When you face off against the CPU, it always manages to place its fielders right beneath the ball, whereas meat-based competitors will always struggle to make their pokey little men scramble to the edges and corners of the field in a timely fashion. It kind of makes you appreciate the deprecated format of baseball seen in games like Champion Baseball for SG-1000 or Baseball for CassetteVision, where the computer handled fielding for you and bypassed all of that nonsense. My kingdom for the outfield skills possessed by a few lines of code on a 6502 processor. But of course, Tecmo didn't really intend for you to play the computer. Baseball is meant to be a head-to-head player-versus-player affair, and Tecmo Baseball is a lot less frustrating when both competitors are bound by the failings of the flesh. Or, better yet, when neither one is. In addition to the standard 1- and 2-player pickup and tournament modes, Tecmo Baseball also includes an exhibition option, which you find in all the best sports games. A computer versus computer setup that means I don't have to fuss with the game myself in order to record footage. But for those who insist on actually playing these games for themselves, well, there are worse NES baseball options than Tecmo Baseball. I'd certainly rather play this than MLB, or even the original RBI baseball, influential as that may have been. I'd rank this in the same sort of middling category of baseball as, well, baseball, the original Nintendo black box game, except with better music, which I suppose is not a bad place to be. Hardly anyone remembers Tecmo Baseball these days, but Tecmo Bowl? Now that is a name that has earned itself a place in the video game Hall of Fame, at least in the US. Of course, what kids really love these days is Tecmo Super Bowl, but you wouldn't have gotten there without the original Tecmo Bowl as a starting point. Tecmo Bowl is simply Tecmo Super Bowl, except less of it. For starters, Tecmo actually went to the trouble of locking down a license here, but only the Players Association license. So you have a bunch of actual names playing in the correct franchise cities under teams with unfamiliar names. Actually, that's not entirely true. The teams here simply don't have names, only mascots. So you can play for teams like the Chicago Emperor Penguins, the Indianapolis Narwhals, or the Denver Elves, I guess? The game only offers 12 teams rather than spanning the entire NFL. I'm not an expert on the lineups of the 1989 NFL season, but from what I understand, which is to say, read on FanWikis, GameFAQs, and Wikipedia, the players in each city accurately represent the names of that franchise's players at the time, along with their actual stats. This means that, for once in an NES sports game, the teams aren't simply just interchangeable palette swaps. Every team has 4 offensive and 4 defensive plays. But a couple of cities have playbooks weighted more heavily to passing than to running, and these differences open up tactical options for players. The mix of in-game players has an actual impact on each team's capabilities and viability on the field. While the 12 in-game teams represent the top-ranking NFL teams of the era, and they all stand a fighting chance, the variability of skills means that fans may want to make selections that represent their own playstyle rather than simply picking their favorite cities. Although the NES game features limited rosters and play options compared to its sequel, Tecmo Super Bowl, it offers considerably greater variety than the original Tecmo Bowl for arcades. The core gameplay comes straight from the coin-op title, however, and that works 100% in its favor. Tecmo Bowl plays fast. Each game plays out over 4 quarters, but the in-game clock is highly accelerated, so that the actual playtime once the ball is snapped amounts to just a couple of minutes per quarter. The play clock does freeze while players make their play choices, unlike in the real sport, but that's a necessity when the timer moves so quickly. And in any case, the tight timer makes a huge difference to the action. I won the game I've recorded here by a matter of seconds, as the CPU team pressed toward a winning touchdown, and I managed to stop them at the 2-yard line as the clock ran out. I don't even like football, and it was still pretty thrilling. But a lot of that comes down to the high-speed, no-nonsense design of Tecmo Bowl. Players make their decisions at the start of each play, selecting one of 4 offensive or defensive strategies with a simple button press. By tapping A and the D-pad simultaneously, each player makes an invisible coaching call, inputting one of 4 strategic possibilities based on the direction they press, attempting to counter the other player's selection to their own advantage. Once the play begins, however, the whole thing doesn't simply fall to the computer to resolve. Although most team action plays out automatically, you still have control over one in-game team member, and using that active avatar to predict and move against the player's actions can often make the difference between success and failure. Tecmo Bowl's CPU doesn't exactly play fair. The further I made my way into a game, the more likely I found the computer to be able to execute interceptions and unimpeded in-zone runs. But the game still offers enough grace that you can pull off heroic feats from time to time as well. And the game builds on the famous dunk animations of Konami's Double Dribble to reward you with little cinematic treats when you score, along with some very awkwardly drawn cheerleaders at halftime. It's a bit crude, but it hints at a major breakthrough to come for Tecmo just a few months later. Tecmo Bowl offers a profoundly simplistic take on American football, and that fact works in its favor. The game's sense of energy never has time to fizzle out, demanding players remain on their toes from start to finish. The subtle variety introduced by the addition of real-world players and stats gives the competitive side of Tecmo Bowl real substance, and it paved the way for the series' future. Indeed, a point revision of the game made a few small lineup tweaks, and the 1990 Famicom release reportedly featured a completely updated roster. The roster element would become integral to Tecmo Bowl's legacy. Tecmo Super Bowl would expand on that feature, and fans would seize on it once ROM hacking became commonplace, continuing to produce fan-made annual roster updates to keep the game current with actual NFL teams and lineups. And by attaching their name to an excellent adaptation of America's most beloved sport, Tecmo cannily cemented their brand in the hearts of an entire nation's youth. It's a strong game and an even stronger marketing coup. Speaking of marketing, what did America's favorite NES advertisement have to say about Tecmo's sports lineup? Perhaps not surprisingly, Nintendo Power magazine had a lot more to say about Tecmo Bowl than Tecmo Baseball. The latter received a brief mention in the third issue's video shorts section. Even Nintendo of America had begun to feel fatigued by the deluge of middling baseball games at this point, it seems. On the other hand, it treated Tecmo Bowl far more favorably. Although Nintendo Power didn't dedicate an entire standalone feature to Tecmo Bowl, the fourth issue included it in a massive 10-page football roundup pitting Tecmo Bowl against Tradewest's John Elway quarterback and LJN's NFL. Tecmo Bowl walked away the decisive winner, utterly demolishing the competition. The game also won the 1989 Player's Choice Award for Best Player versus Player Game. No real surprise given the game's ubiquity in the magazine's monthly top 30 rankings throughout the year. Really, it would only slip off the charts once its superior sequel came along. But here at the beginning of 1989, Tecmo Bowl was the football sim to beat, and Tecmo's streak of NES hits was only just beginning. Next time on NES Works, going by the title of the game, it looks like we've reached the end of the NES library. So join me next week, everyone, for the grand finale.